Elections tomorrow. Is Kizza Besigye a significant challenger to the rule and authority of President Yoweri Museveni?
Oh, thank you very much. At least from the opinion polls, Kizza Besigye and the opposition alliance that he leads do not pose a big threat to Yoweri Museveni's continuous leadership of Uganda. I think the latest polls place Kizza Besigye at just less than 30% possibility of winning, and Yoweri Museveni at more than 60%. So if that is evidence enough, then one could say the opposition is not a big threat to the NRM stay in power, at least for now.
Well, a lot is at stake. Obviously, Uganda should be going on stream with oil as a new producer. It's expected that investments this year could be above $3 billion. So for investors coming through, there's just a sense that continuity in policy, continuity in leadership is important. So the leadership stays the same. Everything else?
Well, the continuity in leadership is going to be important, but I think that is not enough justification for the suppression of democracy. The way that has been used in the campaigns towards this election is that you don't have to change. Museveni, for example, is on record as having said, given an analogy that is very worrying. He has said that he was hunting, he has now found the animal, and he does not understand why somebody should come and take it over just at the time of reaping. I think that sort of mentality and attitude is not good, even if we want to emphasize the importance of having continuity. Continuity in policy does not necessarily mean continuity in personalities in leadership positions. Those two things, I think, should be clearly distinguished.
But you know, George, this is a raging debate now in Africa as to the fact that African leaders who've been able to reform their economies and actually initiate policies that have led to growth almost enter into some sort of social contract with the people, because under his stewardship, the economy has improved and people's livelihoods have changed. That's certainly the case in Uganda. Will that be a factor that the electorate considers when they make their decision?
Certainly, yes. I mean, you have to consider also the experience that Uganda has had. Museveni has the advantage, and again, he has exploited that very well in this campaign, of having been the stabilizing factor in Ugandan politics. Indeed, the stabilizing factor in the state in Uganda as a whole. So he has said, again in the past, that Ugandans do not have to do so many experiments with leadership. And that, again, has been used as though it is a threat. If you vote out this government, then you could have instability and so on and so forth. But talking about socioeconomic indicators in Uganda during the time of Museveni's leadership, you're right that the economy has been doing well. The average growth rate has been somewhere in the region of 6.5 to 7%. The projection for this year and next year is that the economy will grow at about 7%, and employment rates are declining. But there are other issues in the economy that need to be dealt with. Inequality, for example. Which sections, what proportions of the total citizenry is benefiting from growth? What is the level of unemployment in Uganda as we speak today? So there is reason to celebrate, but there's sufficient reason also to worry. And I think in an election such as this, there's going to be a balance between the two. I do not think that the incumbent president is going to enjoy full advantages associated with the positive experiences of his leadership in the past 25 years.
All right, other questions has to do with regulating this economy, particularly with Uganda entering the space of oil and gas production. There's been this legal wrangle involving Tullow Oil, Heritage, the Ugandan government, just by way of taxes and royalties to be paid. And that is seen as setting a precedent for other issues, such as Tullow selling off its oil stakes to companies like Total and the oil company of China. Are Ugandan authorities aware as to the adverse effects of some of these wrangles for investment?
Well, unfortunately, information about the oil sector in Uganda and how that is being managed is sometimes very difficult to come across. You might be aware that most of these activities are coordinated within the presidency, at the office of the president. There are even allegations that they are left to be handled by people very close to the presidency itself. And one can only hope then that within those enclaves there is sufficient capacity, because otherwise there is a risk that Uganda might lose out on important aspects of the deal. So as it is now, I think as long as that is not very much open to public scrutiny, as long as it's not open to research and study, there is a risk that Uganda as a country might lose out if this is not managed well.
Other elements is the relationship that Uganda has with donors. About 30% of Uganda's national budget is donor-sponsored. So it does give donors a voice in terms of the democratic process and how it's conducted. What do they say about some of the concerns you've raised, that the democratic exercise isn't necessarily without its flaws?
Well, that is a major concern now as we go into the elections tomorrow. In fact, I think it's probably going to be one of the biggest carryovers from these elections into Uganda's economy and into Uganda's development, because, like you rightly say, a huge proportion of Uganda's development budget is donor-funded. But following the press in Uganda in the last few weeks, one can tell that the president is not very keen on pleasing anyone in these elections. He has made statements that are definitely unsettling in donor quarters, including his last press conference yesterday in the evening. So it will be very, very interesting to see indeed whether donors are going to maintain their commitment and disbursements to Uganda if they form the opinion that the electoral process did not go very well. And there are high chances, going by some of the statements that the president has been making in the recent past, that this opinion might gain a lot of popularity in donor circles.
You mentioned that Uganda has been growing in the region of 6.5%, 7%, and there's lots of expectation that there's going to be a bonanza in petrodollars once Uganda starts exploiting its estimated 2 billion barrels of oil in the coming months ahead. Plans for investing, for instance, in the refinery sector, plans for other investors by way of pipelines to Kenya. There are a lot of those initiatives underway, but what are the risks of entering this market?
The risks of entering the market are there. Like I said earlier, there is the problem that is there with the management of this resource in itself, the way that the institution of the presidency and indeed the government is dealing with this. It is not open to examination by specialists, especially from outside Uganda, and even those from within Uganda who are not viewed to be close to the interests of the presidency. So the risks, therefore, abound in that sense, because experiences from other countries show that people go for the best alternatives when all information is made available, when all criticism is made publicly and openly and considered in major decisions. That is not the case with the management of the oil resource in Uganda. And to that extent, like I said in my earlier comments, there is a possibility that several mistakes could be made in exploiting this resource.
So governance is a risk, but what about the foreseeable opportunities? You talked about social development indicators, high inequality. Certainly some of these petrodollars could be used to address those problems. And is that what the electorate is hoping will happen?
Well, the experience from other countries, again, will be useful here. There are situations where countries have discovered natural resources such as Uganda's oil, but not necessarily managed it well. They have not necessarily improved the living standards of their people for something that is normally called the curse of the resource, or the Dutch disease, meaning, of course, that governments might start to be non-responsive. Government might even relax on collection of other revenues, domestic taxes. They might relax on foreign direct investment and so on. So if the oil resources, if the natural resource rent is going to fill other gaps that will be empty because the government has relaxed in other ways of raising resources, then the development record might not necessarily be impressive. So it will depend very much on the leadership. It will depend on how the leadership views this. The worry in Uganda is that the leadership seems to think, and particularly the NRM leadership, that this is everything that they have waited for. And one can only wait to see again, how is the government going to behave after this election? If they don't do it well, the experience might not be as good as people might think.
Obviously, we're working off the assumption based on opinion polls and surveys that it's likely that President Museveni will win this election. But what if there's an upset? Are the institutions and the mechanisms for dispute resolution existent in Uganda? I know that there have been numerous legal battles where Kizza Besigye has challenged the validity of results and the legitimacy of elections. Have they improved on systems?
Not quite since the last election. But one thing that you want to cite as being very good in Uganda compared, say, to countries like Kenya is that they have a definite period for resolving election disputes. And that is set within, I think, 14 days before even the president is sworn in. So that is something good. But that does not say much about the independence of the judiciary. That does not mean that the people who will be making those decisions or determining the disputes are independent enough to be trusted with the process. I mean, like any other African country, or most of the African countries, Kenya included, Uganda is largely a presidential authoritarian system, you might say. And in situations such as those, the independence of the judiciary is not something you want to bank on. So one can say then that you do not expect that an opposition will rely on those mechanisms for redress in case something goes wrong.
And finally, what's the role of Parliament? I mean, there was a vote that created term limits on the presidency. If that particular decision has been taken by Parliament in recent years, surely there should be an ability for them to exercise an oversight role. Does it matter?
Parliament matters, but you'll remember that in this particular election, something very unique has happened in the Ugandan Parliament just at the start of the year, after the passing of the supplementary budget. You know, members of Parliament were each given 20 million Uganda shillings in circumstances that border corruption, actually. So yes, Parliament is all the time and everywhere a very important oversight arm of government, on the executive particularly. But where you've got an incumbent that is hell-bent on compromising Parliament, sometimes, again, you can't rely on Parliament, just as I talked of the judiciary. And there's debate in Uganda now as to whether the 20 million shillings given to each parliamentarian is not meant to compromise Parliament in situations such as what we were talking about earlier.